Logan. Welcome to EMS and The Economist. I am joined by Shawn DuBravac, who is the chief economist for the Global Electronics Association. Shawn, I'm going to start with the elephant in the room. 42 days of government shutdown. Where are we, and what impact is it having on the wider economy, but perhaps more so on the electronic manufacturing industry?
Yeah, obviously, we're looking at the longest shutdown that we've ever had in U.S. history. We are probably, at the time of this recording, hopefully just hours away from things getting back to normal, and we should probably say normal in quotes.
Yeah.
Seeing the government reopen, it'll probably take some time for some of the things that have been shuttered to really get back to full steam. It has been a challenge when it comes to data. Probably the worst time for the government to be closed was right now. The last, for example, unemployment report that we have is from August, and by all indications, the labor market has deteriorated in the last 2 months. So I think there will be a lot of eyes on the flow of government data as that starts to reopen.
A bit of a lack of hard numbers on some of that stuff. The great thing about the Global Electronics Association is they never close. So your data has still been coming out every month. How has how's the book to bill looking, and how's the sentiment looking, particularly there in the US?
Yeah, sentiment actually is looking I would say pretty solid for an environment that is pretty uncertain. It does look like we have worked through a lot of the backlogs, and things feel to be in a pretty good balance, I would say, between bookings and shipments. But anything could change that. Certainly, deterioration could change that. It does look like some things have maybe been a little bit lumpy, perhaps in anticipation of the government closing. There was a little bit of a pull forward, perhaps, that took place in some of the electronics in the U.S. But by and large, the sentiment looks pretty good. We'll be publishing the next sentiment report here in the coming days, and it's looking pretty consistent with what we have seen in recent months.
And particular sectors, the defense industry still seems to be strong. It's particularly strong in Europe. Is that ongoing in the US at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the challenges for the electronics industry, but also one of the challenges for the economy, is that at the aggregate level, things look pretty good. But then when you look at the foundation, it is very narrow. And you see this across a number of different facets of the economy. If you look at investment, it's all being driven by AI and data centers. When you look at other segments of the economy, they tend to be being driven by a small segment of the population. Consumer spending looks pretty good. Holiday spending looks pretty solid, but it's really being driven by a small number of households, a small percentage of households, those households in the higher income bracket. And so wherever you look, you see aggregate levels that look pretty good, but you see a much more nuanced story when you look at the underlying data.
We just saw SoftBank sell $4 billion worth of NVIDIA shares, which turns out to be 0.1% of the company value. But I'm hearing more and more in the news cycle about concerns about AI being overhyped, and the investment being just on a level that has not been seen before. Back to the days of the railroads. Is there concern about that? Is there concern about overhype? Is there concern that we're building a bubble that at some point has to burst?
There's definitely concern that we're in the midst of an AI bubble, and by all definitions, we are seeing a tremendous amount of investment flow in. I do think it looks a lot different than past technology bubbles. If you go back to when we were putting in fiber in the ground and we saw overcapacity and overbuild there, a lot of that fiber was still dark. We were putting it in the ground, but it would take years and even decades for us to fully take advantage of that fiber. And obviously today we benefit tremendously from all of that overbuild and overcapacity. It feels a little different with AI, partly because a lot of the investment is coming from companies that have strong underlying cash flows. You think of all the hyperscalers, the Metas and Googles and Amazons of the world, they all have very strong cash flows that can support this type of investment. So for the most part, it isn't speculative investment. It isn't companies that are taking on a lot of debt that they're not going to be able to service. There's a lot of I would say earnings behind the investment. I also think that the companies recognize that this is a long-term investment. I don't expect the AI investment to slow down anytime soon, certainly not within the next 12 to 18 months when you just look at the commitments that have been made. But they recognize that even if there is a little bit of overbuild in the short term, it will be to their advantage in the long term to have some of this capacity online. I think the real restriction here on growth isn't necessarily the investment from the hyperscalers, but it's the availability of electricity and energy to power these data centers and to power this build out.
When we talked earlier in the year, we were constantly talking about tariffs. People seem to have just got used to the fact that there's this noise in their life and it's tariffs and they have to deal with it. They have to be ready for it. And they're trying to build as much agility in their business to deal with it. The one trend I did hear a little bit about recently, particularly in the US, and this was from a CapEx, capital equipment company, was that they were selling machines to OEMs that had decided because of tariffs to in-house their manufacturing. So to reduce their dependence on outsourcing, because their outsourcing was coming from overseas rather than move to a US manufacturer, they decided to insource. Are you seeing that as a trend within Global Electronics Association? Is that something you're hearing about?
We're seeing that trend, and also we're seeing companies look at a myriad of approaches that they can take to address the uncertainty. Some of that, as you noted, was bringing some of that manufacturing in-house. I think everything is on the table, looking at different partners, looking at different countries, looking at different regions. I even hear from some companies where they brought some things from China back to the US, but then as the steel and aluminum tariffs were put in place, they moved some manufacturing that was in the US to Mexico because there they could avoid some of the aluminum and steel tariffs and still bring it into the US under USMCA, so avoiding the tariffs altogether. So there's a lot of movement taking place. I do agree that companies have settled into dealing with some degree of uncertainty and some degree of volatility. The big issue on the table right now is if the AIPA tariffs are even going to be considered lawful or not. And so what comes out of that, I think, will have a big impact on not only the electronics industry, but the broader economy. So, for example, if they are ruled illegal, are there refunds that need to be made? How quickly are those made? If we see a large amount of refunds made in quick order, then that looks a lot like a fiscal stimulus plan. All of a sudden, all of these companies have more money that they could invest in. And so whether they sit on that investment because of uncertainty or whether they redeploy that capital elsewhere remains to be seen. But we could see a lot of growth come out of something like that. We could see, purchases pick up and other things like that take place. So that's all on the table, and we'll be hearing more about that in the months ahead. At the same time, you do see the administration moving towards other type of tariffs, 232 and 301 and other type of tariffs that they can put in place, sectorial tariffs that have a little bit more of a process to them. There's a little bit more visibility into the timing and what might be impacted. And so I to your point, it doesn't mean that we're going to move completely away from tariffs, but they'll always be dealing with them. They'll always be a piece of it. I do think companies have done a tremendous amount to mitigate the impact of the tariffs. You see it at every level of the supply chain. Retailers have absorbed some of the tariffs so that they aren't passing the full impact onto their consumers. In some instances, they're trying to figure out which products are most tariff sensitive and most price sensitive, and so they're passing it on where they can, when they can. In the middle of the supply chain, you're seeing companies figure out how much do they absorb, how much do they pass on. At the same time, you do see costs coming down elsewhere. transportation costs and warehousing costs and some other costs like that, I think are the growth in those costs are slowing. And so the whole supply chain is coming together to mitigate the impact of tariffs.
I think it still will be on the agenda in 2026. And I think people are mindful, but they have strategies. They have much better data sets around their bill of materials and around their supply chain. They've put better systems in place to respond as quickly as they can. So I think that's a good thing. We're coming towards the end of the year, and we're coming towards the kind of, I think of them as the scene-setting events during the year. We've got Productronica next week, which is very much a weather vane for the CapEx guys in the industry. And then, of course, we've got CES at the start of the year. What are your expectations for CES? A lot of talk about AI, I imagine.
A lot of talk about AI. I think the sentiment headed into next year from a tech cycle is still pretty positive. I think there is a lot of optimism in several different sectors. You noted defense, and you're seeing defense in places like Europe pick up for the first time in really decades. The U.S. still feels strong. Other parts of the world that we don't always focus on are investing in those areas. So that continues to push forward. AI, as you mentioned, I think benefits lots of different areas of tech, not just enterprise tech, but also elements of consumer tech are picking up as people look at where could we deploy AI and what type of wearable format might we want AI. I think there's a lot of optimism around robotics. We're still very early on, and when you see some of the early demos of humanoid robots, we're probably still some period away from those becoming something that every household has. But we have moved, I think, quite far that we're even contemplating that these are household ready, that they have a price point that could be accessible to some households. Like, there's a lot happening in the humanoid space, and I think that's an area to watch over the next 36 months or 5 years. I think we can make some fast progress there. And so there are different areas of tech that I think are well positioned for really good growth over the next 5 to 8 years.
Within the CES, we've seen a huge push to the automotive side. It feels like that isn't kind of perhaps top of agenda. I think it was 10 years ago we were at CES and we were promised self-driving cars, and we're still not really there. It feels like AI has kind of push the automotive sector perhaps down to second. What are your thoughts?
I think that's true. I think AI permeates every category. I think that when you look at automotive, you do see many of the big autonomous manufacturers and service providers at CES. You see Waymo, you see Zoox. They have deployed in the U.S. Obviously, Waymo has very strong, relatively strong presence in the U.S. If you look at just California, they've probably done data through the second quarter suggests that they've driven 30 million miles. They've transported 10 million passengers. So it's still small relative to the total. But I do think an important thing has happened. We've shifted from this being a possible technology to this being a feasible technology. There is a level of maturity that we see today in self-driving and autonomous vehicles. Now, we're not all going to go out and own them ourselves tomorrow, or probably not in the next 5 or 10 years, realistically. But as a service provider platform, I do think we're there, and those will continue to deploy out as long as the local jurisdictions allow it, as long as the regulation at the city and state level allow it, and as long as the weather can handle it as well. I think that will continue to be a little bit of a challenge. But even if you look at Waymo's most recent iteration, they're putting windshield wipers on the sensors, and they're doing other things to try to handle inclement weather. They've deployed in Miami and places like that deal with heavy rain, and so they are slowly starting to move north in the country where the weather is more severe. We see autonomous truck driving taking place in the U.S. and in China. So I do think we will make very big moves in autonomous driving in the coming years, even if consumers aren't necessarily owning their own autonomous driver.
Well, I look forward to CES. Hopefully see you there. Hopefully chat a bit about what the ingredient trends are at that show and how they're going to impact our industry. But in the meantime, Shawn, thanks so much for your time.
Great to be with you, Phil.